to introduce our headline keynote speaker. I'm pleased to hear the laughter because I'm worried that you're all falling asleep out there. Please welcome Tamsin Shaw, the Regional Resource Director for VMLY&R.
Hi. Some exciting music to get us going just before lunch. I'm Tamsin, and I just want to say that VMLY&R are honoured to be a partner of today's event. And I have the privilege of introducing Dr. Howie Manns. He's a lecturer of linguistics at Monash University, and Monash University are a long-standing client partner at VMLY&R. At Monash University, Howie focuses his research on language and social interaction in Australia and Indonesia. He has co-authored and edited many books on the topic and is a regular contributor to in Australia and also international media. The title of his talk today is on the hidden power of language. Working in the communications industry, we use the power of language to influence consumers on a daily basis. However, in my opinion, I don't think we see enough conscious use of language in businesses and in teams to make more compassionate, cohesive, and equitable workplaces. I'd like to welcome Howie to the stage.
I get you just before lunch. You're agitated, hungry, and I intend to send you away agitated and watching the way that everybody speaks for the rest of the day. But I hope for the better, because ultimately when we think about the power of language, I don't have to tell a group of advertisers and media types about the power of language. We use language to persuade. We use language to convince people of things. We inform people, but also we dominate people through language, and we subvert domination through language. Now, I'm not going to talk about that overt kind of power or those overt ways that we do this with language. What I'm going to talk about today are those hidden ways that we subtly and perhaps even subconsciously prevent the right ideas from reaching fruition. Whoops, I did exactly what I promised you I wouldn't do. I pressed the laser pointer. Anyway, ideas. Ideas are really delicate things. Don't take my word for it. Let's take Sir Jonathan Ives' word for it. Sir Jonathan Ives, the Chief Development Officer at Apple. What is really interesting to me about Jonathan Ive is he specifically moved to the Silicon Valley from the UK. And the reason that he says he did this was because he didn't think that the culture in the UK was necessarily conducive to developing ideas. It was too cynical. And he pointed out to Stephen Fry that ideas are so fragile, it's easy to miss an idea because they can be so quiet or they can be snuffed out. And my thinking is that if Jonathan Ive would move from the UK to Silicon Valley to make sure that his ideas get heard or his ideas get through, and the reason that you have an iPod, or these days I think we've moved on, the reason that you had iPods was in fact because of this guy moving from Essex to Silicon Valley. So the question suddenly becomes, do we have the right culture in our own companies to be able to make sure that these ideas reach fruition and don't get snuffed out? Today, I'm going to talk about the hidden power of language and hopefully have you going away thinking about this and about how some of the subtle and perhaps subconscious ways that we prevent ideas from being heard ultimately are because we have some really antiquated, actually, views of language. I'm going to specifically talk about apostrophes, and this might seem like a funny thing to talk about, but we're all out there looking for the gotcha moment on Twitter with our Twitch forks, right? Waiting for that they are, their error. We're also out there waiting for that it's error, right? But these long-held views that we have about the apostrophe, I'm going to show you, are actually not that long-held, and they're a bit arbitrary. I'm also going to talk about double negation and the history of double negation. This might seem, again, weird, but what I want you to show is a lot of these, or what I want to show you is a lot of these long-held beliefs that we have about these linguistic items are actually not that long-held. More so, with double negation, we can trace it to a single individual. So you all are obsessed with this idea, or those of you who are, with double negation, because a single dude in the 18th century liked Latin. More on that in a second. I'm also going to talk about these apps that have come out in recent years to help women stop apologizing and saying words like gist or I think in their emails, because they make my blood boil. And I'll get to that in a moment. But I thought a good way of starting might be to actually look at a real good speaker. Not a really good speaker, a real good speaker. Now, feel free to react when I put this picture up, but here he is, a real good speaker. Yeah. But seriously, he has the best words. He says so himself, and who are we to judge? But in all seriousness, yeah, his ideas are garbage. Of course, some ideas deserve to be snuffed out. But he does a lot of very clever things with language that we sometimes ignore, and by ignoring these clever things that he does with language, we actually say more about the way that we think about language than the way that he speaks. Now, whoops. Among other things, just really quickly, he does a lot of repetition at the start of an utterance and the end of an utterance. I don't want to dwell too long on this, but it's useful to think about this because this is actually a very clever idea if you want people to remember what you're saying. To be fair, it shouldn't be an exact repetition. It shouldn't be that much, but ideally, you can put anything from a linguistic, scientific, social, psychological perspective. You can put a lot of stuff in the middle, but we most typically remember the stuff that comes at the beginning and the end of an utterance. So it's kind of clever. But the thing that I really want to talk about today is the fact that he speaks at a 6th grade level. And people lose their mind about this. We love to actually say that, well, he's dumb, right? We all lost our minds saying he's very dumb. He speaks at a 6th grade level. Well, if you think about this differently, he actually speaks very accessibly. So it's not that people at a 9th or a 10th or 11th grade level can't understand what he's saying. In fact, they can, but people as young as, or let's talk about educational attainment, people who have educational attainment to about the 11 or 12 years old can understand him. That's the point. And realistically, if we're going to say that he's dumb because he speaks at that level, well, guess what? George W. Bush is smarter than Barack Obama because George W. Bush, George Bush Jr., uses more complex language than Barack Obama did. What does any of this mean? Well, what these tests actually measure are our use of Anglo-Saxon words, so Old English words compared to Latin, Greek, and French borrowings. These borrowings that came in the Middle English period. Now, why this is relevant is because if you study language, if you look at the language that people use in society, the language that gets used the most are Anglo-Saxon words. These are the words that we learn when we're younger. A lot of people are disappointed, actually, to find out when you measure the number of words or what the most common words are that we use in our daily lives. It's actually the. Sorry, it's so disappointing. Where did all of this stuff, well, firstly, let's talk about messaging, sorry. Now, on the one hand, we can look at this as the dumbing down of society. That's what a lot of people look at this as. But in fact, some of the best speeches in history, some of the most memorable speeches in the history are actually almost entirely written in Anglo-Saxon words. Winston Churchill's famous "We shall fight them on the beaches" speech has a single French borrowing in it. Surrender. I don't want to say anything about the French. But it has a single French word in that speech. The rest of it we remember because it's pithy, it's strong, it's Anglo-Saxon. Where did these views come from anywhere? Where did our obsession with French, Latin, and Greek words come from? Well, it stretches back at first from that time that they first got borrowed into English, which is from about the 12th century or so. But really it picked up in the 18th century. And a lot of our attitudes about language actually come from the 18th century. It might surprise you to know that until the 18th century, we were actually really permissive in the way that people varied their language. We weren't obsessed with those got you moments with grammar, not until the 18th century. The 18th century has a lot to answer for when it comes to this, but also in terms of changing the ratio. Apostrophes. Yeah, let's talk about that. I talked about these twitch form moments, these gotcha moments. Well, up until the 16th century, scribes and writers weren't that concerned, really, with how these were being used. But they began to notice in the 16th century that we didn't pronounce words like you are, or you will, or I will. So they had different ways of dealing with it. This is the way that William Shakespeare dealt with it. But the scribes actually at the time began to notice that the French did something. And of course, we've already established that all things French are good and educated from the perspective of the educated in the 18th century. So they decided to start putting an apostrophe in there to represent these letters. Now, fast forward to the 18th century, and you might think that the possessive apostrophe has been around for a very long time, but it's not. All the way up until the 18th century, this was possession. So we would say, father, his shoes. This his was the possessive marker. Mother, her shoes. This was the possessive marker. Parents, their shoes. But, of course, we established that we don't actually pronounce all of these letters. So, father, his shoes got reduced to this, father's shoes. And these missing letters got represented by this apostrophe. But then people thought, well, this must be some kind of possessive marker. That's what happens with language. We take a lot of guesses over time. So clearly, if this was possessive, and this was possessive. So suddenly, in the 18th century, we had a possessive apostrophe. We didn't until then, really. So something else happened around that time. People really liked apostrophes. They thought they were the coolest thing. So they were putting them everywhere. They were putting them where they thought missing letters were. They put them where they thought there might be possession. And they just put them where they thought they looked pretty. It's something that we called apostrophation, the inflation of the use of apostrophes. So think about that the next time you're going out for that twitchfork moment to kind of stamp out those ideas. Because, in fact, apostrophes are pretty recent, and we've been doing apostrophation for a very long time. So be kind the next time you go to the chippery or wherever it is that you might see these things. But yeah, the 18th century, a lot of things happened in the 18th century. Let's talk double negation or triple negation. Now, it might actually surprise you to know that if you go back into Old English times, double, triple negation, well, that's just the way that you said no really strongly. So you could use one no, and that meant no. You could say two no's, and it was no. Or you could say three no's, and it was fuck no. That's essentially what we used negation for up until the 18th century. And in fact, we can go to any number of wonderful writers like Geoffrey Chaucer, and we can see him using double negation really as a strategy all the way through his writing. You can see it in the Canterbury Tales. So where did all this bollocks about double two negatives equal a positive come from? I mean, where did this come from at all? Because I don't know about you, but this was drilled into my brain when I was a child in school. This dude, specifically a single dude, decided that two negatives equaled a positive because he liked Latin and he liked logic and he thought this sounds good. So he put it into a grammar in 1762. So this is the good Bishop Richard Lowth. Now, every time you hear somebody complain about a preposition at the end of a sentence, that dude. Every time you hear about confusion between who and whom, that dude. Every time you think about whether you should say you and I or you and me, that dude. So go ahead, that dude. That dude is actually causing you to stamp out potentially some good ideas from the kinds of people who use these things. Now, why does any of this matter? And I hope you'll indulge me a really, really quick personal story that is relevant. This is my school. I went here about 30 years ago. It closed down 15 years ago. And it closed down because this was one of the worst performing schools in the state of Pennsylvania. This school was actually graduating people who didn't have basic literacy skills. And eventually they had to close the school. And people who went to this school, people like me, we left and we had what you would call bad grammar. Double negation, we're not very good at using a, the, knowing when to use it, when to not. We say real good, not really good, these kinds of things. We come out and we say these things. Oddly enough, a postscript is, I went back and they said, you dumb son of a bitch, you talk like the dictionary now. Such it is with language. But I want you to remember, and this is becoming more relevant as we're seeing more speakers of English around the world. You're greatly outnumbered, firstly, as standard English speakers. You're greatly outnumbered as just English speakers more generally. There are more English speakers in China right now than there are in the United States, Britain, Australia. There are more English speakers in China, and they say stuff like real good. They say and use a lot of these linguistic items. So the question to ask yourself is, to what degree is it useful to leave these individuals out because they can't necessarily follow the rules? And I hope that I've pulled that curtain back a little bit in discussing these rules, in showing you that when we pulled the curtain back, the answer for why we use these rules is in fact because of some Latin-obsessed white dude in the 18th century. So, yeah. And it's worth noting that they didn't always have your best interest in heart when we look at these individuals, such as with the good Samuel L. Johnson and his definition for oats in the dictionary, a grain which in England is generally given to horses, but in Scotland supports the people. Some bad ideas circulating around that time. I wanted to go on to another thing. This is a big bugbear for me. I spent a lot of time studying language. I spent a lot of time studying Persian language over my history. I've studied Indonesian and Javanese. I work with the deaf-blind community here in Australia. And we're interested in how successful conversation unfolds. That's a really key interest. Now, when we look at language, language is greatly skewed across any of these contexts by gender. And women cop it hard when it comes to language. Just in everyday words that we use. Lion stands for lion and lioness. Tiger stands for tiger and tigress. We look at words that refer to women over time, and almost without question, words that refer to women degenerate over time. For instance, if we go back to the 16th century, the word whore was actually a term of endearment. So it was a term of endearment for either sex. So you could come home from work and you could say to your husband or wife, "Hello, my whore, I'm home." But then it got attached to women. And when it got attached to women, well, I think you know how this story ends. There's a similar story with slut, actually. Slut originally referred to an unkempt or slovenly person. So if you go to your mate's house and there's shit sprawled everywhere, that person, if you go back to the 16th century, was a slut. But over time, it got attached as an insult to women who didn't take care of themselves. And then once again, over history, it continued to devolve into what we know the word for now. Now, to set out what I'm going to talk about briefly here about interactions, when I study interactions, what I look at is what do people say about language, but also what do people do with language? Because it's really important to do both, because what people say about language is not actually what they always do. So to give you an example, if you ask a man, what kind of language he uses. Almost inevitably, a man will tell you that he uses non-standard language, he uses slang, he swears a lot if you talk to somebody. And the reason is that this is just something that's valued in society. If you look at the transcripts of people speaking, they don't do it nearly as much. That's relevant for the business world because it spreads a particular myth that I'm going to talk about now. Sorry if I burned your eyes out. It's this idea that women shouldn't apologize or say just or I think in emails. And in particular, I wanted to talk about this. This came out about 2 years ago. It was a plugin for Chrome to help you ladies write your emails. And to write your emails if you were upwardly mobile and wanted to be leaders. And it was called the Just Not Sorry app. So what would happen is you would write your emails, and this plugin would underline words like sorry, I think, I'm no expert, just actually, does this make sense? Try. And it would underline these words and say, this email doesn't have gravitas. It would say, this doesn't convey leadership. So these little mocking blocks, like that annoying little paperclip that used to come up, but it's like a sexist paperclip. This was designed by women, though, and the purpose of this, it was well-intentioned, okay? It was absolutely well-intentioned, this app was. But it made my blood boil in 3 ways. The first way, essentially, is if we're to redress gender imbalances in the workplace, this is like a tiny plaster or a tiny Band-Aid on a sucking chest wound. This isn't going to get you there. The second way that it made my blood boil is somebody who studies different languages and the way that conversation unfolds across languages. These kinds of words are actually the social lubricant that make us not hate each other when we're talking. Genuinely, I can tell you across Persian, I can tell you across Indonesian Javanese, I can tell you across deaf-blind Auslan conversations, the people who do not use these words are generally not viewed as good communicators. Now, the third reason that my blood boils about this is my first thought was, well, where are those email apps that teach men not to be assholes? That came to my mind. I thought, well, isn't this a useful way to talk about this? Now, before I go any further, I do want to point out that women, on the whole, if you study language, do a lot of the conversational shit work. I feel like, having watched conversation for a good 25 years of my life, I fear that we would still be in the woods if it weren't for women moving these ideas forward. And what I mean by this in terms of conversational shit work, it is women that enable or spend a lot of time enabling turn-taking by using politeness markers, by asking questions, by using a lot of those exact discourse markers that I was talking about a moment ago. You see this across languages, and you see this pushing ideas through that might not otherwise get pushed through. Think Jonathan Ive, okay? So, just to walk you through a couple of the fallacies around this, is women can't win when it actually comes to not using these kinds of words or using them. If you delete your apologies, you get called bossy. Women cop it hard, let me tell you, in terms of using masculine language styles. The other myth is that if you talk to people about the way that leaders communicate in business, they will tell you not to use these things, that they make you sound less authoritative. But when you actually study the language of leaders, and I have, you find that they use masculine scare quotes and feminine styles, and what's really important is that you use them at the right time. Don't simplify language by saying that we have to get rid of things, but rather recognize when they have to get used. As a closing example, linguist Deborah Cameron mentions this email that she got from a man during her holiday. And this man was saying, sorry to disturb you over the holiday period, but I'm just trying to firm up the schedule, and I wondered if you'd have time to check your diary yet. Have a great new year and get back to me when you have a chance. Deborah Cameron points out that she didn't think he was weak. She thought he was polite. Oh, but let's run it through the Just Not Sorry app. I'm trying to firm up the schedule, so please check your diary and get back to me as soon as possible over holidays. So that's my point today, is just we need to pay attention to these subtle ways, in these hidden ways, in fact, that language impacts power, and that language is most powerful when we're not thinking about it. We have to tend to these fragile ideas. Where do we go from here? This is me actually visiting my old house. I don't know what happened to it. They ripped it down. Now, my point is we can't fix this shit with apps. That's what I want to say. We can't fix this with apps. The way that we have to fix this stuff is by a change in attitudes. And I hope this kind of stuff that I've talked about here has been useful in helping you to think about how you approach conversation. That's the true hidden power of language. So ta.